important thing to do right now, I think, just because it gives a lot of people who may or may not actually have the traditional suburban lawn space to put in garden beds, but have the interest of growing some of their own food, the capability to do so. You can do this in small spaces and in very inexpensively start up, and you can get things growing quickly. So I just thought this was a really fitting growing technique or tool for people to have in their toolbox right now with everything going on. So. So I always like to start my talks with a quote, and tonight I'm going with, if you've never experienced the joy of accomplishing more than you can imagine, plant a garden. Gardening in general, and with microgreens, I think it's especially fitting to be able to see much more detail, and you're paying so much more attention when there are microgreens and you're growing them in the baby form. You're checking them daily. It just sometimes gets overlooked when you're in the garden. When you have large beds and everything, you throw some seed in the ground and it might be a week before you realize it's even sprouted. But the process that seeds go through is pretty phenomenal. So we are going to see a lot of that growing microgreens and talk about that tonight. So what are microgreens before we get started? Microgreens are baby plants, and they are typically, although not always, harvested before their first true leaves form. So we are getting the infants, not even the babies. We are getting the teeny tiny little sprouts within the first week to 2 weeks of them coming up. And that is what a microgreen is. Now I said sprouts, but they aren't actually sprouts at all. There's a very distinct difference between microgreens and sprouts. Microgreens are grown in soil. We'll be talking about the soil blend we use and everything tonight, but sprouts are grown in water. So there's two big differences between the growing styles. With the microgreens being grown in soil, they have more energy and nutrients available to them than just what the seed has to get them started. So basically what happens with sprouts is, and microgreens, all seeds have energy stored in the seed to give them that initial few days worth of growth. So when you're growing sprouts, the only energy that plant is getting is from that tiny little seed. And that's what sprouts it, and that's how it grows, and then it's you eat it. But it's used a lot of the nutrients that were stored in there to get the growth. When you use microgreens or grow microgreens, it's using outside resources besides just what's given to it in the seed itself. It's able to use the nutrients from the soil. So they're typically more nutrient dense than sprouts. The other big distinction between them is the fact that they're grown in water, which if not, now there's generally not an issue with the sprouts, but if, especially on a home scale, if you're not paying attention or you don't do enough water changes, there is a risk of bacteria and foodborne illness from the sprouts, which you just don't experience with the microgreens at all. So safer and more nutrient dense. I've only ever grown microgreens, and I wouldn't grow it any other way. There's just no reason not to. So why do we grow microgreens at all? Why are we harvesting baby plants? One is the fact that they are so incredibly nutrient dense at that point in their lives. They have all of the stored energy from the seeds. They haven't expended a lot of that energy into growth, large amounts of growth, and they've done studies, and it does depend on the quality of the soil you grow it in and the variety of seed that you planted, but on average the microgreens are 10 times more nutrient dense than the adult form. So let's take, for example, broccoli. A lot of the brassicas are grown as microgreens. It is 10 times, the baby sprout is 10 times more nutrient dense than the head of broccoli that we would normally eat. So that's pretty stellar. It's almost like vitamins, you know, nature's vitamins. It's, they're just so packed with nutrients that some people will actually use this as their vitamins to make sure that they're getting enough in. They're also super quick to germinate. So from seed to harvest, depending on the variety you choose, you're looking at about 10 to 14 days. That is insane. Even radishes, which are, you know, by most standards, like the quickest growing crop, you're gonna need 3 weeks minimum, maybe 4 weeks, depending on the variety, before you'd ever be able to harvest a radish. And most crops are 2 to 3 months. We're talking about 10 to 14 days. That's a really powerful tool, especially right now when we want things quickly, to try to eliminate going to the grocery store, reduce it, and just provide some of our own food. The other nice thing about microgreens is that they can be grown indoors or in small spaces. You don't need a lot of room to grow microgreens, which is so nice. I work with a lot of clients and they're apartment dwellers, or they, you know, they only have a little tiny patio in a townhouse. So when you're able to grow indoors on a little table that's set next to your south-facing window, that's a pretty powerful tool to maximize the area you can grow in. And I always like to say almost, but they are almost foolproof, because they don't have the issues that a typical garden would have, because there's such a short time frame that they're growing. So they typically don't have bug issues like pests, garden pests. The one caveat to that would be squirrels. You can kind of see here, and I have, I think, a couple of better pictures, but I actually had to cage my microgreens in when I was growing on a commercial scale from the squirrels, because they would just tear them up every time. But in general, we're not having to deal with caterpillars or aphids or anything like that. They don't need a lot of effort from you, and all you're really giving them is in the soil already, so you don't have to worry about maintenance or fertilizers or anything like that. So it just takes a lot of the guesswork or trial and error that typical gardening has out of the equation when you're growing microgreens. It's a much more straightforward process. All right, so we have the materials list. I'm gonna hop on over to, and the other thing too I forgot to mention is, please do, if and as you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box as you think of them. That way, if there's a pause or whatnot, I can jump right over and start answering questions. So if anything pops up, just make sure to type it as you think of it, and I'll get to it as we transition from topic to topic. All right, so it looks like we're good for right now. All right, so what do we need to get started? What do we need to get growing? You need a tray. I use 10-20 trays. It's a gardening term. They are, go figure, 10 inches by 20 inches. So they're 10-20 trays. They have drainage holes. They're very cheap and affordable. So they're just a good starting point for a lot of people. You can buy them singly, but more often than not, they're going to be in packages of maybe 10 or up to, you know, 500 if you're doing it on a large scale. But just a real affordable entry point. And I like the fact that they're shallow. So they're only like 2.5 inches deep. So you don't have to waste a lot of soil filling it to get to the top. They also stack really well, which is helpful when you're doing microgreens. We'll talk about stacking a little bit further on in the talk, but they're just real convenient for that. But with that being said, you can use anything for a tray. If you already have something lying around the house, or, you know, honestly, you could even convert yogurt containers or whatever else you have around the house. Anything that can hold the growing medium and that can be covered with weight, you can make work for this. So if you don't want to buy the trays, that's cool. Just think outside the box and figure out something around you that works. But that being said, the 10-20 trays are usually quite reasonably priced. A couple of maybe 10-20 cents a pack if you're buying a bulk package. Worm castings. So worm castings, if you've been to any of my other talks, I am a huge fan, but it is not just because I am a huge fan. They do offer a pretty ideal growing medium for us. So I use, and some people will use compost, and if it's a good quality compost with a lot of nutrients in it, you can sub that out. I'm all for being sustainable and closing the loop. So if you have quality compost, then go for it. But if not, I would suggest doing the worm castings. They are a bit expensive for the bag. I think they're 25 to 30 bucks a bag, which is a lot. But as you'll see, this growing medium gets reused over and over and over again. Even when I was growing on a commercial scale and pumping out a lot of trays a week, I didn't change my growing medium out or refresh it, but every 3 to 6 months. So it goes a really, really long way. So even though it's a little expensive, I would recommend doing that if you don't have quality compost on hand. The other thing you'll need is coconut coir. This is for the moisture. Coconut coir is a sustainable alternative to peat moss. So it holds moisture really well, but has pretty much no nutrients. But when they're a seed, they really need even and consistent moisture. That's a really important factor for them. So the coconut coir is going to be blended in with the worm castings to create our growing medium. It is ideal, although not necessary, to sift the coarse material out. So if you've never worked with a coconut coir brick, they expand into about 2 to 4 times the size of the brick itself. And most of it is a very loose, almost soil-like fiber, very small pieces. It's darker brown, but there is mixed in with it longer hair-like looking things. So if you have the time or whatnot, you can remove those from the blend, and it just helps some of the smaller seeds germinate a little bit better. The last item you're going to need is seed. Go figure. To get our garden started, we're going to need seed, but I will highly recommend not paying specialty prices. There are a lot of kits out there or websites that say microgreen seed and they upcharge for it, and that is just silly. That seed is the same as any other seed. The only difference is that I would recommend buying in bulk. And that is the one downfall of this growing technique, is because we are not allowing the plants to reach maturity, we are not saving seed. So the constant input here, besides the setup materials, which are minimal and can be reused again and again and again, there is the constant input of seed that you're going to have to purchase. So I always recommend buying bulk, and you don't need anything fancy. So I would recommend, like, we're going to talk about different varieties and stuff to grow, but literally just a bag of black oil sunflower seeds will do the trick. They grow just fine as microgreens. So you can literally buy bird food and it'll grow for you. But making sure to purchase in bulk quantities really helps reduce the cost of growing microgreens and can make it actually a fairly affordable entry point. All right, so I did see a few questions pop up. So before we move on to the different varieties, I'm going to head on over there and answer a couple of questions. All right. Okay, got those questions answered. Okay, Teresa asked where to buy all those things. So all of these items can be found at Avid Brewing if you're local. They are open right now. I always love to support local. They are a garden and grow store and brewery. The brewery is not open right now, but you can purchase that stuff there. Or actually not the bulk seed. I don't think they have any sort of bulk seed, but you can find the coconut coir and the trays and the castings there. But for the bulk seed, you can literally, Home Depot or Lowe's, but you can also purchase online all of these items. So when I send out the recording from tonight's class to everyone after the class, it's 24 hours afterwards, you'll get a recording. That will also have a hyperlink to all of the products that I mentioned, and that's through Amazon. So when you purchase through those links, it does help support the work that I'm doing and is greatly appreciated. Or you can head, if you want to get growing before then, you can head to my website, and I have links there as well for you to click through. All right, so the next question was, Marie asked, do they always need south sun exposure? No. If you're growing indoor, south, anything but north technically, but I would say probably south or west would be ideal. You want nice warm sun when they're being grown indoors. So, but it does not necessarily have to be southern exposure. That would probably just be ideal. Let's see here. Amanda asked, do they have to go in trays or is a garden bed okay? I would recommend, so this is going to be a constant turnover, basically every 2 weeks or so. You'll be reseeding these and they're going to need, we're going to talk about the process, but they need pressure and you need to create a dark environment for them and then they start to green. So in general, no, they would not work in a garden bed. All right. Yes, I will be covering the types of seeds. Marianne did ask about the containers. Do they need drainage holes? Yes. Yes, they definitely need drainage holes. They do have trays that are waterproof, but I used to give them out in kits when I did this as a workshop, and people would flood them out almost every time. So when you water, if you're growing indoors, just leave it in the sink or put a little catch tray underneath it, but don't water into a tray that does not have drainage holes because you will probably flood them out and you'll have mold issues and stuff. So, all right, so let's see here. If you're using any sort of homemade version of a tray, definitely put those drainage holes in there. All right, so real quick, I'm going to type in the local supplier, and then we are going to move on. Actually, Ron's got one good question that's real poignant for this portion. So one tray, the coconut coir, can be reused again as the growing medium. So yeah, we're going to go more in depth on how you can reuse your growing medium for a long time. And we'll go into detail about that. All right, so let's see here. Like I said, we will make sure to get to all of the questions as we go, and if not, at the end, I'm happy to stay afterwards till everyone's questions are answered. All right, so what to grow? The two most common microgreens that are grown commercially are sunflower sprouts and pea shoots. I love both of them. I grow both of them. My other favorite is radish. Those were the three that I grew almost exclusively when I was doing it commercially, and that's definitely the three that I grow for personal consumption. But you can grow a ton of, I mean, really anything besides like nightshades, which would be like tomatoes and eggplants and pepper, solanaceae. Anything other than them are pretty much good to grow. So what's really popular is herbs. So the flavor of microgreens is really a lot more, it's like the adult form, but maybe slightly more potent. So the radish have a delicious spicy kick to them. The peas have almost it's a fresh pea taste, but almost a little bit nutty. I feel like the sunflower greens might have a hint of nut to them, but they're just more of like a general leafy green taste to me personally. So, but the brassicas are like broccolis. People will grow amaranth. And like I said, the herbs, so the herbs grow much slower. You're looking at like a month before you can harvest. And that was just always too slow for me. So I never really did much with the herbs. But it can be done. All right. So we're going to talk about next the growing medium and then the steps to get you growing your microgreens. The growing medium that I would suggest for your mix is the coconut coir and worm castings, and it's going to be in approximately a 60 to 40 ratio. 60% coconut coir to 40% worm castings. This doesn't have to be measured super precise. Eyeballing's fine. I'm kind of one of those gardeners, and it seems to grow just fine. But if you do want to measure, you can do it exact. And this is to help hold moisture in the soil for the seedlings to sprout and still give them a little bit of nutrients. Worm castings are very, very potent. They're very good stuff, have a lot of nutrients in them, so a little bit goes a long way. So that's going to be the base that we're going to be using. And I will, let's see if there's any questions. Okay. We're going to be talking about some of these questions people are asking through the slides, so I'll just hold as we go. All right, so someone did ask, RJ asked, in Florida in summertime, wouldn't northern exposure be sunnier and warmer than southern? No, not really. It'll be overhead more than anything, but if you're growing indoors, southern exposure is almost always the ideal scenario. If you're questioning it and you don't think it's going to be enough, I would go for a western window because that'll get your afternoon sun in. And especially like the peas, if you're growing peas, they actually don't need our warmth at all. They could care less about it. In our summertime, it's actually too much for them. When I was doing commercial greens, microgreens, I would do my peas started indoors and then just take them out for the last day or two to green them up in the peak of summer just to help them grow a little faster. All right. So we're going to keep on moving and we will go through the steps on planting day to get your seeds started. So the first step in this process is going to fill our trays, or whatever tray, or the 10-20 trays, with the growing mix that we made. And remember, that is a 60% coconut coir to 40% worm casting ratio. Like I said, doesn't have to be super precise, but that's the gist of it. And you're going to fill the tray about 3/4 of the way or so full, and try to smooth it out as best you can. So making sure there's no big dips or divots or anything, because basically what happens is if it's not mostly smooth, it'll catch water there. And then those seeds will probably germinate quicker or potentially mold when the other ones don't. And speaking of mold, there were several questions that popped up about that. Mold on your trays. If it's that white fuzzy mold that sometimes occurs, your microgreens are actually still perfectly safe to eat. It doesn't transfer in a quick rinse before you eat your microgreens, which is recommended regardless of whether there's mold on the tray, is okay. But that shouldn't be a normal occurrence. The only time you have mold is if, and it's that white fuzzy mold almost always, if you get any at all, it's overwatering. Putting too much water into your growing medium. And we're going to talk about watering as they grow, but in general, that would be the indication to you. So if you're not comfortable with it, then you would just you would scrap that microgreen round, and you can let the soil dry out a little bit. So if you have another tray, you could just get started on that one and let the medium dry out a little bit, so that the mold dies off, and then you can reuse that growing medium, or you can compost it if it does mold and you're not comfortable with it. So filling the trays about 3/4 of the way full, smoothing it out to the edges and corners and all around. And then what we're going to do is seed whatever seed you have evenly across the tray. There's no need to bury it. That's going to be in the next step, so you don't have to press it in, tamp it down, dig holes, none of that. Basically, you're going to take your hands, and normally this is a workshop, so I can like show people what I'm doing, but you're just literally going to sprinkle the seed out and evenly distribute it across the soil surface. So I have that picture up in the right-hand corner to just kind of show you, for example, how dense this can be planted. So we're not looking for garden-like spacing on these plants. They're never going to reach their full size, so we don't need to give them elbow room. If you have like basically like a light carpet of seed across it, that's good. That's just fine. For sunflower seeds, it took about a third of a pound of seed to seed one 10-20 tray. So to seed one of those black plastic trays that I showed you that are really readily available for gardening, it took about a third a pound of seed when I would distribute it, when I would weigh it out. Just to give you a reference point if you're getting started with sunflower seeds. So you're going to evenly distribute them and make sure it's oftentimes when you're sprinkling, you miss like the edges and the corners, and that's valuable real estate. You know, it's going through the process. We're growing in a small space. We're trying to maximize everything we can. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually start on the edges and I'll go around the edges, getting the corner, and then I seed the center just so I don't skip it. After that, what you're going to do is sprinkle a thin layer of pure coconut coir on top. This is not the blend. All you need is just coconut coir. So usually what I would do is I would have, you know, a bucket or a tub with my growing medium blend, and then I would have one of just the coconut coir. And I would just sprinkle that on top. That also does not have to be tamped down or pressed in. You just sprinkle it on. That's all it needs. And then you're going to water. That is our next step. Gently watering the trays. You don't need a spritz bottle or a spray bottle. A hose will work fine. But if you are doing smaller seed, if you have anything like if the hose doesn't have like a head on it, or if you're trying to use your sink faucet, maybe some sort of watering can or something like that, just so it's not a stream going into the tray, if that makes any sense. So yeah, you want it moist but not dripping. So if your soil is super saturated and super wet, like if you take it and squeeze it and water is just like dripping out like a continual drip, that's too much water. You don't need to water a heck of a lot. There's all that coconut coir in there, so it really holds the moisture well without having to inundate the whole thing. All right, the last step on planting day is to nest the second tray on top. So I mentioned in the first slide for the materials, you can't just have one tray, you need two. And you'll see why in just a second. But basically what we're going to do is nest that second tray right on top and basically create a lid with pressure. So we want weight on it. And basically the environment we're trying to create is that we're faking the seed out. We're telling it it's underground. So for it to believe that, it needs that pressure and that weight of soil being on top of them. So we flip the tray over and put a little weight on it so that we are mimicking the natural circumstances the seed would be growing in. So in recap, we fill the tray, we put our seed onto the growing medium, we add a layer of coconut coir on top, and then we water. Put the lid on and let it sit for 2 to 4 days, and we'll get into the time frames in the next steps. But I gave the long-winded and the short-winded, but the more you do it, it's very, seeding a tray should take you 2 to 5 minutes max. It's a very quick process, especially once you get comfortable with it, and not like growing on a commercial scale comfortable with it. It really only takes, you know, 1 or 2 times of doing this before you understand the process, and it's very simple and second nature. All right, so before we move on, I will take any questions that have popped up so far. So I'm going to hop on over to the question and answer section, and then I'll go over to the chat. All right, so Amy, we did talk about molds, so we should be good on that one. If you do have any more questions about that, do ask though. Janice says, I have to grow outside. The sun here kills everything no matter what. I'm from Jersey and want to do herbs, also other things. What is the best sun exposure? So we'll talk herbs or whatever after the class. We'll just focus in on the microgreens for now, and then I'll get to that question at the end of class. All right, so we have, okay, we got Joy covered there. So let's see here. Myra asked, is peat moss okay to use instead of coconut coir? Yes, if you have it already lying around, but make sure it's the broken up fine, the one you can sprinkle. The one that is kind of like in stringy form for like orchids and stuff won't be good for microgreens because it's not even moisture. What we want to do is basically create like a layer across the entire top of it, and those would be too stringy. Also make sure that it's not Canadian sphagnum peat moss because that's very acidic, and most of the microgreens will not thrive in that condition. Coconut coir is mostly neutral. All right. So we got that covered. Chantel asked if you can use organic manure. Yes, yeah. If you have it from a quality source, then that would be just fine. That's all worm castings are, is basically worm manure. So yeah, that should be fine. I would caution you though that you know your source. If you're using it in your garden beds or whatnot already with success, then it should be fine. But if you haven't, or you're just looking to source it, it can actually be laced with herbicides and pesticides that they spray onto the crops that they feed the horse, that is then passed through the horse's system and into your garden. So I always tell people who are looking to compost or build garden beds to be very careful and know their source. And if you have any questions at all, don't use it until you're sure. If you want to know how you can test manure, if you take the raw manure and put a bean in it, if it doesn't germinate within 2 days, it's no good. It's got herbicides in it, and the bean, if it does germinate, needs to be nice bright green, no deformities or anything like that. And that'll give you an indication that the manure is good to use. All right. So, and just to confirm with everybody, the entire thing will be recorded and sent out after the class, including the slides and the display that you all are seeing. So you'll be able to refresh and use it as a little bit of a checklist once you guys are growing your own. So Teresa asked, do you nest the trays or lid with space between? So when we nest it, we are not putting anything in between. It's literally the bottom of the one tray touching the coconut coir. There's no gap or airflow. Now it will have holes in it because they have drainage holes, so that will, in its own way, create a little bit of air. But no, other than that, it is literally in contact with the coconut coir to give the plant the impression of being underground. Jerry asked, are the sunflower seeds hulled or still in the hard shells when you put them down? They are still in the hard shells. When they're hulled, they're already going to be typically roasted or cooked in some way, and that's not what we're looking for. We want this to be a viable seed that we can germinate. So it's going to be in the shells, and the seed will germinate out of that. Alrighty. Amy asked the question, would you ever use grow lights or a sun through a south-facing window enough? Your specific situation will tell you. We're going to talk about what a plant might look like if it's not getting enough sun. But there's nothing wrong with grow lights. I haven't used them. It's just an added expense. So I've always just managed to either find the windowsill or to find a place outside that I can grow it on, a patio, a carport, wherever, just because I haven't wanted the added expense. But there's nothing wrong with grow lights, so they can certainly be used. Okay, so growing them out. the fun parts. That part where I started my quote is just being in awe of nature and what it's capable of. So we did our growing day. We covered it with a lid. We put a little bit of weight on it. And then we're waiting for them to emerge. And depending on the variety, it's going to take 2 to 4 days before the sprouts start to germinate, just like in that picture there. So what you're going to do is just peek under, and after a while you'll get the hang of it and everything, and you probably won't even need to peek, but there's nothing wrong with lifting it up just to take a look either. So what you're doing is you'll just lift up the tray once a day or so. After at least, it's going to take at least 2 days. It's for sure not going to be on the first day. And you'll start to see when it's ready, that picture there. And that picture is all of the seeds being pressed from the weight, and they're all, that way they all germinate at the same time. So once you see that kind of mostly uniform look to the seeds, you're going to remove the top tray. You'll check the water. Sometimes at this point, more often than not, especially once we get into our humidity like we are now, they don't even need water at this point, but check just to make sure. You don't want the soil medium too dry. And then we're going to flip the lid over. So before, the bottom of the tray was pressing down on them. Now we want it to be the opposite. We're giving them that 2.5 inches that the tray's depth is to grow up into. Kind of like in that middle picture there. That's actually a little bit too far. I let them go a little long, and they were literally lifting the lid up from all of the weight, the strength of the seeds. But so we'll flip the lid over and put another weight on it so it doesn't blow away. And then we get to wait another 2 to 4 days. I did see a hand go up, so let's see here. If you want to chat, type into the chat box. And I'll be able to answer. All right, we answered that one. Sorry, in the past when I've had larger groups like this, I've had a panelist to help me answer questions as we go, so I know it's a little slow, sorry. But all right, so Amy asked, going back to seeds, do they need to be organic? Should we worry about GMO? That is a personal choice. When you are buying bulk seed that I mentioned, like for bird seed and stuff, there is a potential, since it's being grown on large scale by bulk suppliers, that there is GMOs potentially in there. So that would just be a personal decision as to whether you're looking for an organic or non-GMO seed. It is available in bulk for both options. All right. All right. Sean had a question about lighting. I'm considering growing microgreens on my back patio. They would be under a shade sail on a rack against a north-facing wall. Does that sound like enough indirect sunlight? Any issues, differences with outdoors versus indoors? All right, so indirect sunlight, technically they need no sunlight until the last 2 to 4 days. So the first 2/3 of the time, they're not gonna need any light at all. I've literally grown them under my China hutch cabinet thing in my kitchen. If it's been too cold for sunflowers or if it's been too warm for peas, I'll just straight up put them in the house, not even next to a window, and it's fine. They don't need the sunlight until the last 2 to 4 days. At that point though, they will need a decent amount of sun. Otherwise they're gonna get really leggy and they're not gonna green up like you would want. So I would probably say if it's a long enough hours, a long enough duration of indirect sunlight, it would probably be okay. But if it's not getting but a couple hours, maybe 2 to 4 hours a day, it's probably not gonna be enough to help your microgreens thrive. So there is zero difference between indoor or outdoor as long as you can figure out the lighting situation. And then the microgreens are happiest. Which microgreens are happy at which temperatures? In general, sunflowers love heat. They really thrive over our summer months. The peas are a cool weather crop. They thrive in our winters. You can grow them alternating. So like, you know, in winters you would grow peas, and summer you would grow sunflowers, or you can just create false microclimates. So you could grow your peas outdoor in the winter and your sunflowers indoors when you're running heat, and then swap them and create an artificial, like with the AC, grow the peas indoors. So you do have some flexibility to that, but you would basically follow the guidelines of whatever that plant would typically like as to what their growing temperatures would be. All right. So I'm going to answer one or two more questions and then keep going. That way we aren't too far past our time. And then, like I said, I'll stay to answer questions at the end. I just don't want to hold anybody up too long past our expected time. All right. All right, I think we're actually caught up. Woo, cool. All right. So these are just some pictures for demonstration purposes. The picture to the left kind of shows you the different growth stages. That's peas that are in that picture. And that first tray is probably a day, maybe 2 days in. And then the second one's going to be at that 2 to 4 day mark when they've grown in, probably closer to 4. The one right behind it is when we flip the lid up, and then towards the very back there is harvest day, when you would actually be harvesting them. So that's just kind of giving you a gauge or what to look at. Now clearly they were all next to each other, so it's not all the same tray, but you get the gist of it. And so the ones next to it, I thought I had plugged in a different picture there. But it just goes to show how densely you can plant these. And the other thing to note too is if you're one family and you don't need a ton of microgreens all at once, because you only have a couple of day window, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but you only have a few days in between when they're ready to harvest and when they're a little too far gone. So try to make sure to pick it in that time frame. And if you're one household, you may not have enough. You're not going to be able to eat them enough. So you can mix them. So you could do, you know, radish on half and kale, like in that picture, on the other half if you'd like, or whatever works for you. Or the other option is you don't have to seed an entire tray at all. You can just use the larger tray and only seed a little bit into it. And I did just realize I totally, I stopped halfway through, and I usually stop at the end of a slide. So we're actually going to jump back. Sorry guys, and finish out the growing process. So after the seedlings emerge and we flip the lid over, basically at that point we're trying to get height on them. We want them to all be a uniform height because that allows for easier harvesting, and it really maximizes the production. So what you're going to do during that point is they're growing tall underneath that lid. When they reach the top of that lid, the picture in the middle is actually a little too far. They shouldn't be lifting the lid up. That was probably me gone for the weekend or whatever and not timing things very well. But in general, you'll be checking at around 2 to 4 days to see if they're getting close to touching the lid. If they are, it's time to take the lid off and let them start greening. At that point, you'll definitely check again for water. By this time, they probably will need some water. They've been doing a lot of growth. They're very densely planted. So at that point, you'll probably need to water, but not always. It's always check first. But yeah, so that'll give you the height. And now, and it is, some people will ask, is it okay for them to be yellow? That's perfectly normal. They haven't had any sunlight. They don't turn green until they have sunlight because they start the photosynthesis process. So there is nothing wrong with the plants being yellow at this point. The last step is to allow them to green, and that's like the question Sean asked when I was saying they need nice direct sunlight. or long filtered sunlight, a long duration. This is the part where they need a lot of photosynthesis happening. This is when they green up or red up if you're growing, you know, purple radish or whatever the color of the crop is, but when they turn from that pale yellow to a color. At this point, they're growing a lot. They're in the full sun now, so check daily for water. And the sign that there isn't enough light is that they're reaching. So it's called getting leggy in the gardening world. So if they're very tall, they're kind of flopping over, the whole tray is all leaning towards one side. That's typically the side that has more sun. That's an indication that you're not giving them enough light. Nice thing with microgreens though, no harm, no foul, just pick up the tray and find somewhere with a little more light. So it might take you 1 or 2 trays of growing out to find that sweet spot in your house or on your patio or under your, you know, lanai or carport. But once you find it, you'll know you'll be good. And after that point, it'll just kind of gently shift with the seasons and nothing major. So at this stage, it usually takes 2 to 4 days depending on the variety, and then they're going to be ready to harvest. And they're going to be a super vibrant color. That's a sign that they got enough sun. And we're also looking to harvest before their true leaves form. So I think I have a, so if, yeah, so if you've grown plants before, there's baby leaves, and then they're called cotyledon leaves, and then there's mature leaves. So a radish has those are the purple ones in the picture to the right. They have little smooth bee-shaped leaves when they're first germinate. That's their cotyledon leaves, they're baby leaves. And then after that, they get these like fuzzy, long, kind of serrated leaves. We're trying to harvest before those leaves form. The same goes for sunflowers and most other sprouts. Peas are a little different, but we're harvesting those baby leaves, not the big leaves. So if you look into the center of the leaves where the stem is, you'll start to see the true leaves starting to emerge after 2 to 4 days, and that's your sign that it's time to harvest. And once you get nuanced with this and kind of get the hang of things, you'll know that they're about to start those true leaves, and you can harvest just before that point. They don't immediately go bad if they get a couple of true leaves starting to form. So just keep an eye out, especially when you're just starting out, and harvest as soon as you think they're ready. So we had a few questions pop up. I'm going to hop on over and answer some of those. Okay. Kathy asked, how much sun is too much sun? For sunflowers, you can't really have too much sun. They are very heat tolerant, sun loving plants. But they are still baby plants, and if you're growing like multiple different varieties of trays, I would say close to the 6-hour mark would be ideal. But that is a very give or take thing. So if you have a little less, if you have a little more, feel it out. Your plants will tell you. And that's just a general rule to go by. Chantel asked, are those garbanzos? No, those are peas. I use field peas for my pea shoots, so it's just like the black oil sunflower seeds you can buy in bulk. I just buy the field pea because I'm not looking for the end product. I don't care what it tastes like or whatever the pea pods are. I just buy a bulk pea seed. Leah, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce, but can you freeze them for smoothies? Maybe. You know, I never froze them. So I know cooking them takes all of the nutrients out of them. And usually when you freeze greens, you have to blanch them first before you freeze them. So my guess would be no, but maybe look online and see. Maybe that's a thing, but I've never heard of that before. Marie asked, how long after they're harvested should they be eaten? Ideally, fresh. And that's also the perk of having your own microgreens sitting on a windowsill. You can go over there, and like I said, you will have a 2 to 3 day window of when they're good to harvest. So if you're one person and you don't need an entire tray of microgreens, you can go over there and cut off a small handful for your salad or your omelet or your smoothie or your whatever. Use it fresh, and then the next day go harvest a little bit more, and the next day go harvest a little bit more. The first day they might have been a little bit on the early side, and the last day they might be a little bit past, but then they're fresh and you're maximizing the nutrients, because they lose nutrients, all plants do, so quickly once they're harvested that ideally you would be eating them fresh. But with that being said, it may not always work, or maybe you have a large party or you're going away for the weekend, whatever. They will keep in the fridge for up to a week. Just know that even though they look pretty, the nutrients are quickly being depleted. All right. Okay. Let's see, Jennifer asked, what do you use to weigh down the tray lid? Anything you have around you. Old phone book, a brick. I feel like I had pictures of it somewhere. Cinder blocks. Maybe not. Maybe it's later in the slides. Literally anything with a little bit of weight to it. You don't have to be precise or do anything special for them. I would say that if it's something small like a brick, you'd need several just to put weight on the entire tray. Otherwise, you'll only have that good germination where most of the weight is. And then, like, say the edges of the tray, if they didn't have anything, they might not germinate as well. But, you know, it'll be a pretty obvious sign. You'll see great germination and not enough. So that'll tell you more weight. All right, so time to harvest. How do we harvest? We are not going to be pulling them out of the growing medium. Basically, what you're going to do is use a sharp knife and cut just above the soil line. And because we filled it almost all the way to the top between the coconut coir and the growing medium, it's usually quite easy to harvest. So what I would do is I grab a handful of the greens, I take my knife, sorry, I'm trying to get myself in the picture here, and then I literally just cut or swipe the knife underneath my hand, nice clean cut, and then these I can toss into, my basket or my sink or wherever I'm harvesting them into to rinse them, or the salad strainer. So you'll just go ahead and rinse them, dry them. If you are going to store them in the fridge for any reason, do make sure that they're nice and dry before putting them in there. Otherwise, they'll get all, slimy, moldy. You don't want that. And then it's time to enjoy your microgreens. I will be going over how to reuse the soil in just a second, but it's pretty easy, the harvesting process. You're literally just cutting them above the soil line, so you won't have to mess with any roots or seeds being there. I will say with the sunflower seeds, sometimes about a quarter of them, maybe a little less, will still have the whole the seed shell on the tops of the leaves. So before I harvest with the sunflowers, what I would do is basically just take my fingers and just brush the top of the leaves, and it just knocks off all those extra seed shells that never quite came off. I mean, technically they're edible. Some people eat sunflower seeds. It's not like it's going to kill you or anything, but it's just not necessarily what you're looking for in a leafy green. So just knocking them off before harvesting them is much easier than trying to sit there and pick them off individual ones after you harvest. Okay, so now it's time to replant and get growing again. Like I said, you can reuse the growing medium. So basically what we're going to do is you're going to sift out the roots and the bulk seed, the big pieces of seed, like if you did the peas. And you can either compost or feed that to the chickens, the roots and the seed. You can, if you are doing this on a regular basis, a lot of people will basically create like a little sifter that they can dump it through using hardware cloth or something along those lines, and it'll catch that for you. And then you can just fit it over the tray, and it's like really easy to do. But if you don't want to go that extra step, Colander would work just as well. So if you have like a colander in the kitchen, you can kind of sift through the growing medium and then just keep back whatever is bigger and feed that to the chickens, compost it. I mean, technically you could throw it in the trash, but hopefully there's an alternative source for you to dispose of them. All right, so then you're just literally going to dump the growing medium you just had and just used right back into the tray, and you're going to grow again. Starting from those first steps, fill the tray 3/4 of the way full, add seed, cover with coir, go on and on and on. So slowly over time, you will end up having more coconut coir because we are sifting that, you know, like every time we add a layer, and then it gets sifted through, and that's then into the growing medium. So eventually you will notice that you're going to need some worm castings added. You can tell this by the color. It'll be more brown than blackish brown, like the original growing medium. You'll start to notice things like a little bit slower germination, slower growth, maybe a little bit more yellow leaves or deformities in plants. All of those are signs that they're not getting enough nutrients. So keep an eye out for that, and that would just indicate you need to mix in a little bit more worm castings again. I would say if you haven't done any worm castings at 3 months, I would probably add some more in if you've been doing it on like a regular 2-week basis. If for whatever reason you feel that the soil is not fit to use anymore, that it's been just so stripped, or maybe you're having some disease like a mold keeps popping up and you can't figure out what the heck's going on, you don't think it's watering. If you truly feel like it's exhausted, you can compost it. I wouldn't toss it, and if you are gonna, toss it, at least throw it in a garden bed or out in the yard or something. It doesn't need to go in the trash can by any means. So that's the gist of microgreens. This talk is a little bit longer. It may sound complex, but I truly believe once you do it, you'll see very quickly how straightforward the process can be and how quick and easy it is. Like I said, seeding should take you 2 to 5 minutes. The time it takes you to check the trays is like a minute. You're harvesting 5 to 10 minutes max after you rinse it and dry it and the whole 9. So it's a very quick and easy process. You're getting nutrient dense, super nutrient dense food in a very short time frame. It's just a really wonderful thing. All right, so I'm gonna hop on over, answer any questions that anybody has, and then we'll wrap up for tonight. Yeah, so somebody asked again about the recorded webinar, the link for that. So it'll be generated once the recording is complete, and I'll be sending that out within 24 hours after the meeting. So you'll have the entire webinar recorded, including the slides that you see here right now. All right, so let's see here, hopping over to the chat. All right. Okay, so Teresa said, what's your favorite way to eat them? We are big salad and smoothie fans. That's my favorite way to use them because you use a lot of them at once, so you're getting in all of those nutrients, but I also cook with them a lot too. I'll use them as garnishes in my dishes. I'll put them on top of seafood, omelets, anything like that. Basically with microgreens, you don't want to cook it. You just want to use it as a topping, as a garnish, because they're so small. They basically melt away to nothingness if you were to cook them. So generally what you would do is if you're going to incorporate it into any sort of dish or pizza even, you would bake the pizza and then sprinkle the microgreens on afterwards. So there's a ton of different ways to use it. And like I said, they're adding a lot of flavor and a lot of punch to your dishes. So it's a really good way to bring something flavorful into something that would otherwise not be very flavorful. Chantel asked, can any type of vegetable be used for microgreens? Most any, yes. Like I said, the ones that you would want to avoid would be the nightshade family, which is like tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. Those are no good to eat the leaves of. I've also never heard of anybody doing cucurbits, which would be like your melons and cucumbers, but the leaves aren't toxic, so that could be something to look into. But typically it's a lot of any of your leafy greens that you would eat as adults certainly can be used as microgreens. Any of your root veggies, those are fine. Like beet greens are a good one. That's another one a lot of people like to do. Swiss chard is really common as a microgreen as well. Yeah. Yeah. So borage is another one you could do. That's got a cucumber-like flavor in the leaves. All right. Okay, so let's see. All right, somebody likes the dog. I do too. She's my pups. I love her. Okay, all right, so let's wrap up, and then there's a couple more questions, but they're getting a little bit more specific, and I just don't want to tie up anybody's time more than I already have. I'm sorry I went over a little bit. But I do have, if you haven't already connected with me on YouTube, I do weekly, if not twice a week, videos on gardening in Florida. So this is all just free content that I put out there, everything from, you know, how to grow cucumbers to planting tomatoes at the right depth to amending your soil, different pest issues, all sorts of different gardening topics every single week. And it's all based on growing here in Florida in our growing conditions. I just did recently, my latest video was 10 summer greens for a Florida vegetable garden. So 10 leafy greens. So lots of information. Make sure to look those up if you have any questions. I also have a ton of resources online. I have a book list that I found really helpful getting started in my gardening adventures, as well as recommended products. That's where you would find links for the coconut coir or worm castings or 1020 trays. If you'd like to purchase those through Amazon, that is on my recommended products page, and that does help support the work that I do. I also have a list of local resources that I recommend if you're looking to scale things up a little bit. Avid Brewing, of course, as a local resource, but also lumber store if you're looking to build raised beds, bulk soil, all sorts of good stuff. And two, if you are interested or learning about gardening, I do have a vegetable seed club where I mail out 3 varieties of in-season seed to your door each month. And they all come with seed success cards. So like you see pictured here, they're going to give you tips for success when you're planting, when it's time to harvest, different preparation ideas if you're not familiar with it. And it's a really good way to get a hang of the seasons and to figure out which varieties do really well here in our climates. So that's been a really fun community thing that we've started building up. And we do have a private Facebook group where we answer questions and interact as a community. So if you're interested in that, there is the sign up for that is on my website, and I'll send that out as well with the recording. So that's it for tonight on growing microgreens. If anybody needs to head out, feel free. I will go ahead now and hop over to the question and answers and get everybody's questions answered before I officially end the recording. And just as a reminder, all of this will be sent out to everybody who attended tonight and registered for the class. So within 24 hours, you will see this come your direction. All right, so let's see. Sean asked, where can I find locally sourced organic seed in bulk without ordering online? I like sunflower or any other summer liking sprouts. Bulk seed locally sourced is tough to come by, to be quite honest, especially in our urban setting. So it's tough. You'd have to find probably somebody in Plant City, I would imagine. That would be that's our closest like agricultural area. You'd have to do your research and hunt around there. I have not found a good source for bulk seed from our area. I order from Johnny Seeds, which is not close at all, but they're very reasonably priced seed. and they have a wide variety. That's usually where I source my seed from if it's not sunflower seed. The other seeds I source from Johnny's.